and this is our first story tonight by R. Murray Gilchrist, The Basilisk. Marina gave no sign that she heard my protestation. The embroidery of Venus's hand in her silk picture of the Judgment of Paris was seemingly of greater import to her than the love which almost tore my soul and body asunder. In absolute despair I sat until she had replenished her needle 7 times. Then impassioned nature cried aloud, "You do not love me!" She looked up somewhat wearily, as one debarred from rest. "Listen," she said, "there is a creature called a basilisk, which turns men and women into stone. In my girlhood I saw the basilisk. I am stone." And, rising from her chair, she departed the room, leaving me in amazed doubt as to whether I had heard aright. I had always known of some curious secret in her life, a secret which permitted her to speak of and to understand things to which no other woman had dared to lift her thoughts. But alas, it was a secret whose influence ever thrust her back from the attaining of happiness. She would warm, then freeze instantly, discuss the purest wisdom, then cease with contemptuous lips and eyes. Doubtless this strangeness had been the first thing to awaken my passion. Her beauty was not of the kind that smites men with sudden craving. It was pale and reposeful, the loveliness of a marble image. Yet, as time went on, so wondrous became her fascination that even the murmur of her swaying garments sickened me with longing. Not more than a year had passed since our first meeting, when I had found her laden with flaming tendrils in the thinned woods of my heritage. A very dryad, robed in grass colour, she was chanting to the sylvan deities. The invisible web took me, and I became her slave. Her house lay 2 leagues from mine. It was a low-built mansion lying in a concave park. The thatch was gaudy with stonecrop and lichen. Amongst the central chimneys a foreign bird sat on a nest of twigs. The long windows blazed with heraldic devices, and paintings of kings and queens and nobles hung in the dim chambers. Here she dwelt with a retinue of aged servants, fantastic women and men half imbecile, who served before her with humility and yet addressed her in such terms as gossips use. Had she given them life, they could not have obeyed with more reverence. Quaint things the women wrought for her, pomanders and cushions of thistledown, and the men were never happier than when they could tell her of the first thrush's egg in the thornbush, or the siege of bitterns that had haunted the marsh. She was their goddess and their daughter. Each day had its own routine. In the morning she rode and sang and played. At noon she read in the dusty library, drinking to the full of the dramatists and the platonists. Her own life was such a tragedy as an Elizabethan would have adored. None save her people knew her history, but there were wonderful stories of how she had bowed to tradition, and concentrated in herself the characteristics of 1,000 wizard fathers. In the blossom of her youth she had sought strange knowledge, and had tasted thereof, and rued. The morning after my declaration she rode across her park to the meditating walk I always paced till noon. She was alone, dressed in a habit of white lutestring with a loose girdle of blue. As her mare reached the yew hedge, she dismounted, and came to me with more lightness than I had ever beheld in her. At her waist hung a black glass mirror, and her half-bare arms were adorned with cabalistic jewels. When I knelt to kiss her hand, she sighed heavily. "Ask me nothing," she said. "Life itself is too joyless to be more embittered by explanations. Let all rest between us as now. I will love coldly, you warmly, with no nearer approaching." Her voice rang full of a wistful expectancy, as if she knew that I should combat her half-explained decision. She read me well, for almost ere she had done, I cried out loudly against it. "It can never be so! I cannot breathe! I shall die!" She sank to the low moss-covered wall. Must the sacrifice be made? She asked, half to herself. Must I tell him all? Silence prevailed a while. Then, turning away her face, she said, From the first I loved you, but last night in the darkness, when I could not sleep for thinking of your words, love sprang into desire. I was forbidden to speak. And desire seemed to burst the cords that bound me. In that moment's strength I felt that I could give all for the joy of being once utterly yours. I longed to clasp her to my heart, but her eyes were stern, and a frown crossed her brow. At morning light, she said, desire died, but in my ecstasy I had sworn to give what must be given for that short bliss, and to lie in your arms and pant against you before another midnight. So I have come to bid you fare with me to the place where the spell may be loosed and happiness bought. She called the mare. It came whinnying and pawed the ground until she had stroked its neck. She mounted, setting in my hand a tiny, satin-shod foot that seemed rather child's than woman's. Let us go together to my house, she said. I have orders to give and duties to fulfill. I will not keep you there long, for we must start soon on our errand. I walked exultantly at her side, but, the Grange in view, I entreated her to speak explicitly of our mysterious journey. She stooped and patted my head. "'Tis but a matter of buying and selling," she answered. When she had arranged her household affairs, she came to the library and bade me follow her. Then, with the mirror still swinging against her knees, she led me through the garden and the wilderness down to a misty wood. It being autumn, the trees were tinted gloriously in dusky bars of colouring. The rowan, with his amber leaves and scarlet berries, stood before the brown, black-spotted sycamore. The silver beech flaunted his golden coins against my poverty. Firs, green and fawn-hued, slumbered in hazy gossamer. No bird carolled, although the sun was hot. Marina noted the absence of sound, and without prelude of any kind began to sing from the ballad of the witch-mother, about the 9 enchanted knots, and the trouble comb in the lady's knotted hair, and the master-kid that ran beneath her couch. Every drop of my blood froze in dread, for whilst she sang, her face took on the majesty of one who traffics with infernal powers. As the shade of the trees fell over her, and we passed intermittently out of the light, I saw that her eyes glittered like rings of sapphires. Believing now that the ordeal she must undergo would be too frightful, I begged her to return. Supplicating on my knees, "Let me face the evil alone," I said. "I will entreat the loosening of the bonds. I will compel and accept any penalty." She grew calm. "Nay," she said very gently, "if aught can conquer, it is my love alone. In the fervour of my last wish, I can dare everything." By now, at the end of a sloping alley, we had reached the shores of a vast marsh. Some unknown quality in the sparkling water had stained its whole bed a bright yellow. Green leaves, of such a sour brightness as almost poisoned to behold, floated on the surface of the rush-girdled pools. Weeds like tempting veils of mossy velvet grew beneath in vivid contrast with the soil. Alders and willows hung over the margin. From where we stood, a half-submerged path of rough stones, threaded by deep, swift channels, crossed to the very centre. Marina put her foot upon the first step. "I must go first," she said. "Only once before have I gone this way, yet I know its pitfalls better than any living creature." Before I could hinder her, she was leaping from stone to stone like a hunted animal. I followed hastily, seeking but vainly to lessen the space between us. She was gasping for breath, and her heartbeat sounded like the ticking of a clock. When we reached a great pool, itself almost a lake, that was covered with lavender scum, the path turned abruptly to the right, where stood an isolated grove of wasted elms. As Marina beheld this, her pace slackened, and she paused in momentary indecision. But at my first word of pleading that she should go no further, she went on, dragging her silken, mud-bespattered skirts. We climbed the slippery shores of the island, for island it was, being raised much above the level of the marsh, and Marina led the way over lush grass to an open glade. A great marble tank lay there, supported on 2 thick pillars. Decayed boughs rested on the crust of stagnancy within, and divers frogs, bloated and almost blue, rolled off at our approach. To the left stood the columns of a temple, a round, domed building with a closed door of bronze. Wild vines had grown athwart the portal. Rank, clinging herbs had sprung from the over-teeming soil. Astrological figures were enchiseled on the broad stairs. Here Marina stopped. "I shall blindfold you," she said, taking off her loose sash, "and you must vow obedience to all I tell you. The least error will betray us." I promised and submitted to the bandage. With a pressure of the hand, and bidding me neither move nor speak, she left me and went to the door of the temple. Thrice her hand struck the dull metal. At the last stroke a hissing shriek came from within, and the massive hinges creaked loudly. A breath like an icy tongue leaped out and touched me, and in the terror my hand sprang to the kerchief. Marina's voice, filled with agony, gave me instant pause. "Oh, why am I thus torn between the man and the fiend? The mesh that holds life in will be ripped from end to end. Is there no mercy?" My hand fell impotent. Every muscle shrank. I felt myself turn to stone. After a while came a sweet scent of smouldering wood, such an oriental fragrance as is offered to Indian gods. Then the door swung to, and I heard Marina's voice, dim and wordless, but raised in wild deprecation. Hour after hour passed so, and still I waited. Not until the sash grew crimson with the rays of sinking sun did the door open. "Come to me," Marina whispered. "Do not unblindfold. Quick! We must not stay here long. He is glutted with my sacrifice." Newborn joy rang in her tones. I stumbled across and was caught in her arms. Shafts of delight pierced my heart at the first contact with her warm breasts. She turned me round, and, bidding me look straight in front, with one swift touch untied the knot. The first thing my dazed eyes fell upon was the mirror of black glass which had hung from her waist. She held it so that I might gaze into its depths, and there, with a cry of amazement and fear, I saw the shadow of the basilisk. The thing was lying prone on the floor, the presentment of a sleeping horror. Vivid scarlet and sable feathers covered its gold-crowned cock's head, and its leathern dragon wings were folded. Its sinuous tail, capped with a snake's eyes and mouth, was curved in luxurious and delightful satiety. A prodigious evil leaped in its atmosphere, but even as I looked, a mist crowded over the surface of the mirror. The shadow faded, leaving only an indistinct and wavering shape. Marina breathed upon it, and as I peered and pored, the gloom went off the plate and left, where the chimera had lain, the prostrate figure of a man. He was young and stalwart, with a dark outline with a white face, and short black curls that fell in tangles over a shapely forehead, and eyelids languorous and red. His aspect was that of a wearied demon god. When Marina looked sideways and saw my wonderment, she laughed delightedly in one rippling, running tune that should have quickened the dead entrails of the marsh. "I have conquered!" she cried. "I have purchased the fullness of joy!" And with one outstretched arm she closed the door before I could turn to look. With the other she encircled my neck, and, bringing down my head, pressed my mouth to hers. The mirror fell from her hand, and with her foot she crushed its shards into the dank mould. The sun had sunk below the trees now, and glittered through the intricate leafage like a charcoal burner's fire. All the nymphs of the pools arose and danced, grey and cold, exulting at the absence of the divine light. So thickly gathered the vapours that the path grew perilous. "Stay, love," I said. "Let me take you in my arms and carry you. It is no longer safe for you to walk alone." She made no reply, but a flush arising to her pale cheeks, she stood and let me lift her to my bosom. She rested a hand on either shoulder, and gave no sign of fear as I bounded from stone to stone. The way lengthened deliciously, and by the time we reached the plantation the moon was rising over the further hills. Hope and fear fought in my heart. Soon both were at rest. When I set her on the dry ground, she stood a tiptoe and murmured with exquisite shame, "Tonight, then, dearest. My home is yours now." So, in a rapture too subtle for words, we walked together, arm enfolded, to her house. Preparations for a banquet were going on within. The windows were ablaze, and figures passed behind them bowed with heavy dishes. At the threshold of the hall we were met by a triumphant crash of melody. In the musicians' gallery, bald-pated veterans stood to it with flute and harp and viol de gamba. In 2 long rows the antic retainers stood, and bowed, and cried merrily, "Joy and health to the bride and groom!" And they kissed Marina's hands and mine, and, with the players sending forth that half-forgotten tenderness which threads through ancient songbooks, we passed to the feast, seating ourselves on the dais while the servants filled the tables below. But we made little feint of appetite. As the last dish of confections was removing, a weird pageant swept across the further end of the banqueting room. Oberon and Titania, with Robin Goodfellow and the rest, attired in silks and satins gorgeous of hue, and bedizened with such late flowers as were still with us. I leaned forward to commend, and saw that each face was brown and wizened and thin-haired, so that their motions and their epithalmy felt goblin and discomforting. Nor could I smile till they departed by the further door. Then the tables were cleared away, and Marina, taking my fingertips in hers, opened a stately dance. The servants followed, and in the second maze a shrill and joyful laughter proclaimed that the bride had sought her chamber. Ere the dawn I awakened from a troubled sleep. My dream had been of despair. I had been persecuted by a host of devils, thieves of a priceless jewel, so I leaned over the pillow for Marina's consolation. My lips sought hers, my hand crept beneath her head. My heart gave one mad bound, then stopped. And that's the end of the basilisk. I'm just going to take a second to finish my tea and see if anyone has anything they'd like to say, and then I'll go on to the next one. Tea and tea dust, delicious. Yeah, that was the basilisk. But I guess I should just go straight on to the next story since I've got ones to read. 1 second though. Oh, you're welcome, Ray Tracer. I hope it was good. And yeah, I'll don't mind me just riding the mute button for a sec. Okay, I think I'm good. Spooky, indeed. Yeah. Well, we got a few of those. So yeah, I like the way Gilchrist describes the environment and just creates atmosphere and stuff. Oh, you're welcome, Lynn. No worries. It's fun to do. I like doing it. I get into it. Look and see the moon still creeping around. It's still spooky. Yeah. All right. Let's go on to the next story, which is called Witch in Grain. Of late, Michal had been much engrossed in the reading of the black-letter books that Philosopher Bale brought from France. As you know, I am no Latinist, though one while she was earnest in her desire to instruct me, but the open air had ever greater charms for me than had the dry precincts of a library. So I grudged the time she spent apart, and throughout the spring I would have been all day at her side, talking such foolery as lovers use. but ever she must steal away and hide herself amongst dead volumes. Yester even I crossed the roods and entered the garden to find the girl sitting under a yew tree. Her face was haggard and her eyes sunken. For the first time it seemed as if many years had passed over her head, but somehow the change had only added to her beauty. And I marvelled greatly, but ere I could speak, a huge bird, whose plumage was of the brightest gold, fluttered out of her lap from under the silken apron. And looking on her uncovered bosom, I saw that his beak had pierced her tender flesh. I cried aloud, and would have caught the thing, but it rose slowly, laughing like a man, and beating upwards passed out of sight in the quincunx. Then Michal drew long breaths, and her youth came back in some measure. But she frowned and said, "What is it, sweetheart? Why hast awakened me? I dreamed that I fed the dragon of the Hesperidian garden." Meanwhile her gaze set on the place whither the bird had flown. "Thou hast chosen a filthy mammet," I said. "Tell me, how came it hither?" She rose without reply and kissed her hands to the gaudy wings which were nearing through the trees. Then, lifting up a great tome that had lain at her feet, she turned towards the house. But ere she had reached the end of the maze, she stopped, and smiled with strange subtlety. "How camest thou hither, O satyr?" she cried. "Even when the dragon slept, and the fruit hung naked to my touch, the gates fell to." Perplexed and sore adread, I followed to the hall, and found in the herb garden the men struggling with an ancient woman, a foul crone, brown and puckered as a rotten costard. At sight of Michal she thrust out her hand, saying, "Save me, mistress!" The girl cowered and ran up the perron and indoors. But for me, I questioned Simon, who stood well out of reach of the wretch's nails, as to the wherefore of this hurly-burly. His underlings bound the Runyon with cords, and haled her to the closet in the banqueting gallery. Then, her beldering being stilled, Simon entreated me to compel Michal to prick her arm. So I went down to the library, and found my sweetheart sitting by the window, tranced with seeing that goblin fowl go tumbling on the lawn. My heart was full of terror and anguish. Dearest Michal," I prayed, "for the sake of our passion, let me command. Here is a knife." I took a poniard from Sir Roger's stand of arms. "Come with me now. I will tell you all." Her gaze still shed her heart upon the popinjay, and when I took her hand and drew her from the room, she strove hard to escape. In the gallery I pressed her fingers round the haft, knowing that the witch was bound, flung open the door so that they faced each other. But Mother Benmusk's eyes glared like fire, so that Michal was withered up, and sank swooning into my arms, and a chuckle of disdain leaped from the hag's ragged lips. Simon and the others came hurrying, and when Michal had found her life, we begged her to cut into one of those knotted arms. Yet she would none of it, but turned her face and signed no, she would not. And as we strove to prevail with her, word came that one of the bishop's horses had cast a shoe in the village, and that his lordship craved the hospitality of Ford until the smith had mended the mishap. Nigh at the heels of his message came the divine, and having heard and pondered our tale, he would fain speak with her. I took her to the withdrawing room, where, at the sight of him, she burst into such a loud fit of laughter that the old man rose in fear and went away. "Surely it is an obsession," he cried. "Naught can be done until the witch takes back her spells." So I bade the servants carry Benmusk to the mere, and cast her in the muddy part thereof, where her head would lie above the water. That was 15 hours ago, but methinks I still hear her screams clanging through the stagnant air. Never was hag so fierce and full of strength. All along the garden I saw a track of uprooted flowers. Amongst the sedges the turmoil grew and grew till every heron fled. They threw her in, and the whole mere seethed as if the floor of it were hell. For full an hour she cursed us fearsomely. Then, finding that every time she neared the land the men thrust her back again, her spirit waxed abject, and she fell to whimpering. 2 hours before 12 she cried that she would tell all she knew. So we landed her, and she was loosened of her bonds, and she mumbled in my ear, "I swear by Satan that I am innocent of this harm. I ha' none but paltry secrets. Go at midnight to the lows, and watch Baldur's tomb. There thou shalt find all." The beldam tottered away, her bemired petticoats clapping her legs, and I bade them let her rest in peace until I had certainly proved her guilt. With this I returned to the house, but finding that Michel had retired for the night, I sat by the fire waiting for the time to pass. A clock struck the half before 11, and I set out for King Baldur's grave, whither, had not such a great matter been at stake, I dared not have ventured after dark. I stole from the garden and through the first copse. My mistake. The moon lay against a brazen curtain. Little snail-like clouds were crawling underneath, and the horns of them pricked her face. As I neared the lane to the waist, a most unholy dawn broke behind the fringe of pines, looping the boles with strings of grey golden light. Surely a figure moved there. I ran. A curious motley and noisy swarmed forth at me. Another moment, and I was in the midst of a host of weasels and hares and such-like creatures, all flying from the precincts of the tomb. I quaked with dread, and the hair of my flesh stood upright, but I thrust on, and parted the thorn boughs, and looked up at the mound. On the summit thereof sat Michel, triumphing, invested with flames, and the shape approached, and wrapped her in his blackness. And that's the end of The Witch in Grain. Yeah, it's a short one. I guess don't mess with witches. It's probably a bad idea. Don't chuck 'em in ponds. Just let them do their thing. Really, go about the business. Oh, ray trace. I was going to say, it wasn't custard. It was costard, which I tried to enunciate. It is a different word. I don't know what it means. But it's spelled Costard. I'm guessing sort of like accost, as in like it's basically prisoner. That would be my guess. But it's not a word I've looked up. But yeah, Gilchrist even. Murray's his middle name. Gilchrist, because when was he writing these? What was his time again? 1867 to 1917. Uses a lot of old words. But yes, no. Like when I came up to that one, I was like, hang on, I've got to be careful how I need to concentrate so I don't just say custard. Like when I said corpse instead of cops, which is still a word used today. Picturing something different, yeah. Oh, Lynn, you think you consume more books since you found this channel than the rest of your adult life? Oh, well, that's nice to hear, actually, that you're experiencing books. It's actually really lovely to know that we're, providing a new way for people to encounter this stuff. And hopefully bring you things that you're enjoying. It's good to know. How long is the next one? Oh, the next one's quite a long one, so I probably won't start that right now. Do I have another short one to take us up to a break? Bubble Magic is pretty short. Excerpts from Witherton's journal is just kind of weird. So yeah, let's throw that one in, and then I'll... Costard is an apple, you thought? Oh, maybe I'm completely wrong, just trying to be like, oh, look at me being all like etymological. And no, it's not. It's just an apple. Maybe? I don't know. Like I say, mostly when I'm reading through these, I'm Googling pronunciations, not definitions. Because your man Gilchrist throws in a lot of words that I don't know how to pronounce at first glance, or a lot of words that I've read but not read aloud or heard said, and and there is that whole thing of like, if you hear someone mispronouncing a word, don't laugh. It just means they read more, because that's kind of generally a fair assumption that you'll read a word and not necessarily know. I mean, let's say you can read a word, figure out the correct, what would be a correct pronunciation for it, and then someone else would go, no, you're saying it wrong, like Chumley, which is written like Chomondley, or place names like, now I'm trying to think of some, looking at a box near me that's got some written on it, Cheltenham, or what else have we got? Cirencester, these kinds of things, or like Bicester, which is one I used to know. Well, let's say you know, one I sort of, place I used to live somewhere in the vicinity of, not one to dox myself in any way, which is written Bicester, and if you pronounce it like that, you'd think you're correct, but no, then someone from there goes, no, it's Bicester, and it's like, okay, I guess, because the English language is a joke, a cruel joke played on everyone else in the world. We apologise, or we should. Oh, 1 second, I hear a cat. I'm back. Donnie Darkroom, hey, what's up? Is that like Kirkcudbright? Is that, because I'm assuming that's Scottish, which adds an extra difficulty complication to it. But yeah, it is, because obviously one of you that's like Kirkcudbright, but no, I'm assuming mostly it's like you just run the sounds together. Oh, Kirkcudbright. Oh, okay. No, wouldn't have got that. You might be able to hear Joey now. He is now in the room and asking for attention. Our language is a nightmare indeed. I'm sorry, Salad. I genuinely am sorry to everyone that isn't like just brought up in English and has to actually learn it. So many words you never said aloud, but you think you know it right. And again, if you're just reading, it's absolutely fine, because you're like, oh, I think it's this. I can figure it out. You can probably infer the meaning from context and just go on with your life. But when you're like, oh, I've got to read this aloud. Oh no, I need to know how to say this. And sometimes I'll just flub it anyway. But yeah, hang on, I'm going to have to reposition the microphone 1 sec. I'm repositioning the microphone because Joey has just occupied my lap. Thunder, hey, what's up? Welcome. How you doing? I'm just going to try and fit in one more short, hopefully, story before going on a quick break. Hey, 7 months resub. Thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, so I hope you're doing well. I hope you're specifically having, and everyone else. I don't know. I've wished everyone else out there a good weekend, whether you're observing Easter festivities or just enjoying a holiday that you may have, some bit of time off work, hopefully, getting some of the nice weather that we have, at least here in the UK. Hopefully other parts of the world have got that too. Yeah, can you hear Joey? He is very loud and very happy to be here. Lynn, you're English, you hate the English language, especially when it's just a nightmare. Yeah. Yeah, I'm doing okay, Thunder. Still like got a couple of things that I need to sort of sort out, just like wellness wise, but getting there, I think. Native English speakers are just often quite rude about people making mistakes. Yeah, that's a thing. I wish it wasn't. I'm sorry. Again, like for me, I'm just like, no, that's literally how the word is written. You're taught the rules, and then someone goes, yes, but this word breaks these rules, and that word too, and it's just all like a big mess. And yeah, we really shouldn't be rude to other people about it who are actually making an effort to learn our crazy, awful stew of a language, but we do, because culturally that's what we're told to be like. And we're told it's okay, and I apologise. But that is a subject for another time. But yes, I apologise, and frankly, thank you. Everyone that I've ever interacted with through like this or the Longest John's community speaks infinitely better English than I can speak any other language. So, you know what? I'm grateful for that, if nothing else. But yeah, you're wonderful, lovely people. Thank you. Yes. I'm going to keep reading because I've talked up until almost the break time. But yeah, this one, Joey, please let me read the book. He's rubbing his face on the book. Maybe we'll just do that. Just, you want some cat ASMR for 10 minutes? What was it? Oh yeah, so this one I've written a bit of a note to myself. Small content warning for bits, I guess, bits of like ableism and like sort of a little bit of like suicide ideation. If that's sort of something that's going to be upsetting to you, then feel free to duck out. I'm going to be reading it for like the next 10-15 minutes or so, then go to a break. Yeah, again, I'm never like the best judge on some of this stuff. I'm sort of better at seeing what other people make of it and then going, yep, you're right, I will try and do better. Well, actually, no, that's bad. That's like that's not. Sorry, no, that's wrong. That's being really lazy. I was like, you tell me when I do something wrong. I'm just going to go. No, that's not what I mean. More like, yeah, there's people who are better educated and informed who I'm going to listen to. But yeah, sometimes stuff will slip past me because I'm just being ignorant, and that's not an excuse. That's just me acknowledging my shortcomings and trying to do better. And you get better by listening to other people. But yeah, so there's little bits of that. I think it's just in the way that some of the people are described is a little bit kind of harsh and just rude. And yeah, there's just a little bit where one of the characters gets quite low and is kind of contemplating ending it all. So yeah, just some heads up about that. But yeah, this is excerpts from Witherton's journal. Also a letter of Christalla's. The principal events of Pliny Witherton's life are written at length in Goodwin's Records of English Painters, a volume published by Dodsley in 1752. He is described therein as one whose genius went beyond his achievement, who suffered ecstatic pain in conception, yet brought forth little worthy of remembrance. Personally, he was small and ill-formed, of that sallow countenance and red skin-like hair wherewith tradition has gifted Judas Iscariot. His gait was felinely nimble, his voice harsh. Notwithstanding his great defects, he was a favourite with women. He died at his zenith. His celebrity was ephemeral, for, possessed of a curious medium, the secret of whose preparation he refused to share with any contemporary, he used it with such fatal effect that his works, which were strangely rich at first, became almost colourless after the lapse of a few decades. The only picture still existent is at Hambleton, where is also preserved the journal whence the following extracts are taken. It is a Boadicea, faded to a sober brown. January 12th, 1700. This morning my uncle chose the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. I know not how I bore his tedious droning. He pictured the dullest scene, put into their mouths the dullest words, and there came something that thrust a hand through my breast and caught about my heart and forced tears down my cheeks. Oh, to have shown them what I beheld! Little Anne saw me through the broken panel of the Earl's pew, and put her fingers to my knee to feel the thrilling. But I thrust them away, for the child is a bastard and ugly as a toad, yet not so ugly neither, but foreign. Her mother came of the Rouvenyes, and pale and quiet. She is downtrodden by Madame the Countess. Maybe I was hard upon her. The lass blanched, for had she not but yesternight slyly given me her father's present, a golden guinea, to buy colours for my work? What if she give me no more? Alack! So after the Amen was mumbled, I stole with her to the pools amongst the groove hillocks, and showed her rush-tips covered with hoar above the ice. As we stood, she put her arm about my neck, and said, "We are both lonely, none loves us." And I fell angry again, and struck her face. "I am not lonely, I shall be famous," I cried, "but you, mistress craven spirit, are fit for naught but nursing madam's brats." May 1st, 1703. Too terrible fortune, prisoning me in an iron cage. From between those bars I see thy wheel turning, turning, turning. Today is my 20th birthday, and I have done no work for all these years. Creations enow have stirred my brain. I see heroes in jewelled harness, ruddy-hued and beautiful dames. They play their parts, yet when I take the crayon, 'tis to depict a crowd of malkins. God, never was being so ill-fated. Anne brought me a purse woven of her own coarse hair. It held 8 crowns and a posy ring. Yesterday I had threatened to leave this accursed house and never send word. She has now sold all her trinkets. The office of secretary to such a dotard as the Earl I loathe, and the continual buzzing of my hummer-bee uncle frets my very soul. I walked with Anne on Danman's moor, and the strong winds blew a colour into her hollow cheeks. Moreover, her eyes looked very big and lustrous, but she wore such a faded gown as any village alewife would have scorned, and the looseness made her shoulders seem huckled. Withal on her lips was such a smile as I shall give Christ's mother in my masterpiece. As I gazed, the rosiness deepened, and she murmured in a voice half moan, "Is there aught worthy there?" So, being malicious of humour, I praised that smile, and saw her bosom rise and fall like a wild beast's panting apart from the hunters. January 9th, 1704. At last I have left Hambleton. There was no money there, and my lord strove to repress my ambition with its eternal, "Thy uncle on his deathbed wished it so, for, leaving thee not a penny, he commended thee to my care. The chaplainship shall be thine, and I need no secretary work, save what thou canst do at odd times. Alas, 9 daughters have I to dower." And Anne had given me all, so I rolled my pictures in a bundle, and am come to seek the patronage of our great men, who, as I have learnt, are ever ready to help on struggling wits. July 27th, 1704. O heaven, that this world should be so cruel, flouted in rich fools' antechambers, turned roughly from door after door. Shame devours me today, for, though poverty no longer pricks me, I have sold my honour. 20 gold pieces earned with bloody sweat lie on the table. The signs were delivered scarce 2 hours since. The first I wrought had some solace, for the angel was a careful presentment of Lucy, as sweet a maid as England holds. But 12 years old, and yet with the wit and loveliness of Sheba's queen, how she shrivels her base-born half-sister. 100 times since I came to this town has her proud excellence disquieted my slumbers. The beauty that daunts a man's the beauty for me. Accursed be this vile place where art and genius crouch together in the alleys. September 30th, 1704. The last page I may write in this poor journal shall contain naught of anger. Once I read that he conquers who strives with circumstance. No greater fallacy was ever writ. The last coin is spent, utter ruin in store. The certainty of my gift hinders me from pandering again to the vulgar. Life and I nearly parted at the great humiliation. Those terrible pictures, to whose doing desperation forced me, haunt me like ghosts. I dared not pace the streets lest I should see my handiwork swinging over the causey. It is better for me to die. To Anne I bequeath all good and tender wishes, for she alone would aid me in my early strugglings. In this, my last hour, I fully acknowledge her kindness. October 1st, 1704. Dolt that I was to lose courage! At last the goddess hath smoothed her frown. When I rose at the sound of knocking, 'twas to find a cloaked and hooded woman at my door. The domino fell open and discovered Anne's face, haggard and stained with tears. In her hands she carried a heavy bag. My Aunt Ruvigny is dead, she cried, and since she might leave me naught by will, this she gave me in private. None knows of it save myself. It is yours. All lies before you now. Take the road to fame. And though we had not met for so long, she waited for no word. Dear heart, to resign that fortune for my sake, when I have seen all that Europe boasts, and studied the works of the Dark Masters, I will return and make her my wife. Here is a copy of what I writ to her at Hambleton. Mistress, I entreat you would be pleased to receive my very great thanks for the largeness of your generosity. I have warmer dreams of my work than ever, and with travel and the instruction of Italian artists I hope to do wondrous pictures. You have been my staff, and when the day comes that I already foresee, I shall cast myself a willing slave at your feet. I am your humble servant, Pliny Witherton. The journal contains an accurate narrative of adventures on the continent. Anne's gift was 1,000 guineas. The relation of Witherton's amours in France and Italy is worthy of Smollett. Anne's constancy is noted at intervals. Her father and the tyrannical countess had died, and left her guardian of their 9 children, and she spent the years at Hambleton fostering the estate. Witherton suffered anguish before the Titians at Venice, and swooned in the Sistine Chapel. English art being what it was, his work won him some notice in Rome. Success strengthened his imagination, and his creations became more virile. At the Russian court, whither he travelled from Italy, he was made painter-in-chief, and found his emoluments so large, and his position so vastly improved, that at the end of the 5th year he returned to England with the intention of fulfilling his promise to Anne. January 1st, 1710. 'Tis no longer the Hambleton of my boyhood. 'Tis a centre of wretchedness and parsimony. Then all was lavishness, open house, the whole world welcome. Even whilst the leather hung rotting from the walls, came tons of wine and rare fruits for each season. Now a new order ruleth. To the deuce with such cheese-paring. Mistress orders the fish from our own ponds. Mistress orders the gorecocks to be killed on Danman's Moor. The meanness of habit that sickened me in earlier times has now reached head. And yesternight I made her understand. In the days before the cognoscenti acknowledged my genius, we had been wont to watch the new year in from the windows of the Grecian temple that lies a quoit's cast from the hill walk. When we had supped together, she rose from the table and curtsied with an old maid's awkwardness. "You play hoodman blind when I am by," she said. "You do not see my gown? From Firenze you wrote that purple becomes pale faces best." But one at table had worn damascene of pale green, woven with gold and silver arabesques. Lady Lucy, a debonair maid, rosy lips and eyes like Venus, and I had sight for no other. Mistress drew me to the bay, and pointed to the clearing beyond the pines, where 7 squares of light fell on the frosty grass. "In your honour, O painter mine, a fire has burned there all week, and now 500 candles are lighted. When we went before, 'twas as downtrodden children. Tonight let us sit and watch and listen to the bells." She laid her hand on my arm, and drawing over her shoulders the rich furs I had bought as a spousal gift, passed with me from the house. When we reached the temple steps, she ran forward and flung the valves open, so that, even ere we entered, we were bathed in the glow. Inside much reparation had been done. The walls shone in white and gold, and the ceiling fresco of Aurora pursuing night was newly cleaned and restored. The chamber was warm and sweet with burning logs. We closed the door and sat on the pigskin stools by the fire, the length of the hearth lying betwixt. Drifting against the glass came the noise of Edale bells. The lads were drunk as ever, lashing out the old tempestuous jangle. "We are crowned," she said. "We have ever fought side by side, and now we are victors." I looked at her, and saw that the frost had pinched her face and reddened her eyes. Then I gazed at Aurora, juicy and fresh. On the hearth lay a withered leaf that had tapped in after us. On the table a great yellow rose, and I was moved by these things to speak the truth. Anne, let it be all over between us. We have grown apart. Life together would be miserable. I have my art, and you would bind me to earth. From this night we will be cordial friends. Lovers we have never been. I cannot love you. After a while she turned her eyes from mine and bowed her head. Better so, she murmured. I am not worthy. For an hour she sat in silence, flushing and twining her hands. Christalla's Letter to the Spectator, January 19th, 1712. Mr. Spectator, as I have dwelt in these wilds since my birth, and, though an earl's daughter, have never been permitted to show myself in London, a description of my face and figure must needs give you pleasure. 'Tis not my own, but that of Pictor, read to me from this journal. Of a full, ripe beauty such as none but virgins of high birth possess, a face neither round nor oval, but something between, touched with the softness of an apricot's sunside, eyes lupin-coloured, in sober moments half lit behind velvet lashes, but when roused sparkling azure fire, lips such as a god might pasture on, shoulders pure and white and smoothly dimpled, and a waist of most admirable shape, a foot so arched that Philip, her pet sparrow, cowers neath the instep. Methinks, sir, if you but saw me, spite of your melancholy, you also would fall in love. Though I be modest, I protest that the picture is nowise overcoloured. The simple country folk are so enamoured of my person that the louts line the way to church, and swear when 'tis fine, "'Tis Christalla's weather." That your humble servant may receive advice concerning the disposal of her person, she begs to lay her case before you. For 2 years she has been courted by an aged nobleman, who offers her a position of highest rank, and such wealth as only pertains to princes. There are many stains on his character, but he is old and not like to live long. And now Pictor himself comes forward and sighs at my feet. He is a man of great fame, and, moreover, one attached by old kindness to my family. He is strangely ugly, being livid-skinned and orange-tawny-haired, but, notwithstanding, it has never fallen to me to meet a man of so many attractions. Maybe his stealthiness charms me, for he is like a cat treading softly and creeping from all manner of places, and I vow I would rather wed him than the handsomest man made since Adam. He hath had love passages with a poor relation of mine, whom my parents, in return for fancied services, made guardian of my sisters and myself. She is a vixen and a shrew, who fancies to keep us within bounds, but I'll have none of her. Pictor, coming from a foreign land, brought her many gifts, utterly forgetting your handmaid, but their meeting was the quaintest and coldest thing, on his side, that I have yet beheld. When he saw me, his humour changed, and he put himself forward to delight, and his witless creature wept for very joy. With time, however, I saw his distaste grow and grow, till I could scarce forbear twitting both. Now I see her going quietly about her work, but sighing in odd corners as if her heart would break. So, dear Mr. Spectator, I desire you to inform me whether, being an earl's daughter, it would be great folly in me to choose the painter and flout the duke. The one holds me in chains of fascination. The other, though I don't hate him, wakens no tender feeling. I am, sir, your dutiful and obedient servant and admirer, Christalla. P.S. I entreat you let me know soon. And that is the end of excerpts from Witherson's journal. And I have Joey who wants to go out, so what I'm going to do is go very quickly to a break, but I'll be around in chat for like any chat and comments stuff. And we'll be back in like 5 minutes or so for a couple more stories. Thank you in advance for sticking around. I'll see you then. And I'm back. We're back. Hello. Yeah, the sunglasses are showing up on the heart for me. I don't know why they wouldn't be for you. So hopefully that's not like a thing. Hey, Sil, what's up? Welcome. Hope you're doing well. We have... How many stories have we done? Is it 2? 3? Yeah, we've done 3. We are 3 stories in. We've had the Basilisk, Witch in Grain. You know, about a witch being thrown into a swamp. And excerpts from Witherton's journal. About an artist who's just kind of a jerk, I guess. That was my main takeaway from that one. You need sunglasses for your chill heart. Yeah, we were just discussing that. I mean, I'll try it. I'll do it on mine as well. Actually, I'm going to do it for free. One of our single emote. Our single emote. Boop. I say free. I mean, it costs 900, but if I do it on the main account, bam. How's that? Hey, Josh. 3 stories. That's so many flights of stairs. Thank you. Thank you for the good joke. How are you enjoying the PPR? I'll be going over there to watch that after this. For those that don't know, that's a big old Magic the Gathering party stream. Sorry, I'm just messing with the mic. Going on Loading Ready Run at the moment. So yeah, that's where my attention will be after this stream, along with food. But wow, the Soul Read. Yeah, it's almost like I know that you watch them too. Right, what was I going to read? I was going to read next. There's The Grosso at Ravensdale, possibly followed by Bubble Magic. Currently watching the PPR. Nice, good. Well, I'm going to give you some background noise. Yeah. Anything else I need to say? No, I don't think so. Other than this story, when I read it earlier, has some incredible names in it. Yeah, again, I'd say it's like another trait of the period in which Gilchrist wrote, but I think Gilchrist himself just kind of likes using some archaic stuff, which sometimes, you know, can be a bit much and like trip me up, and I'll just read whole words, whole ass sentences that I have no idea what they mean. And other times it gives us such treats as Peregrine Fury and Lady Mary Tufton, and Tryphena Wilbraham, which, like, there's almost Dickensian grade naming. This is great, and I love it. But yeah, apologies for all the noise that I'm making here, like adjusting on my seat and fiddling with the mic and stuff. I don't know that I didn't write any content warnings myself for this one. I don't know, because I think it's possible that I missed things. Yeah, I think we're mostly safe on this. I'm just trying to remember what the actual content of this one was. Just a bit more Gothic weirdness, you know, things happening to people and then being like, well, it's probably safe to proceed, and then dying. So, you know, good bit of that. But yeah, this mainly just enjoy the naming in this one. But yeah, carrying on with our next story for tonight. This is, as a Gothic, you like Gothic weirdness, that is not the name of the book. That is just the comment I'm reading out from chat. Well, you know, then you've come to the right place, because I have the Gothic weirdness for you. But yeah, this is The Grosso at Ravensdale. 3 weeks after the wedding of Peregrine Fury and Lady Mary Tufton, daughter of the Earl of Thanet, the young couple left Newbottle, my lord's Northamptonshire seat, and journeyed in a new coach and 6 to Ravensdale, the bridegroom's estate in one of the most remote peakland valleys. Of the journey they knew but little, each being vastly in love, and deeming no prospect in the world comparable with the reflection to be found in the other's eyes. Mrs. Tryphena Wilbraham, a kinswoman of the young lady, one of those useful spinsters upon whom devolve the smoothing of other folks' paths, had been sent, the day after the nuptials, to see that the house was set in readiness for one who had been accustomed to luxury from her birth. Peregrine Fury had not visited the place since his infancy, the late owner, his uncle, Sir Agabus Webb, having alienated the affections of all his relatives by a middle age marred by eccentricity of no very pleasant nature. For a life of Sir Agabus, one must consult the 3rd volume of the British Magazine or Monthly Repository for Gentlemen and Ladies, wherein is a brief biography entitled The Character of a Miser Founded on Fact, though veiled under a fictitious name. There it will be seen that a conjugal catastrophe changed a harmless gentleman into a parsimonious hermit, whose whole energy was devoted to almost incredible cheese-paring. For well nigh 20 years no fire burned on the hearths of Ravenside Lodge. The doors and gates of house and garden were ever kept locked and barred. Only one servant, an elderly female, was permitted to sleep beneath the roof. Eggs with cresses from the stream made the baronet's usual diet, although it was occasionally varied by a partridge or rabbit trapped in the garden. Throughout those years, Fuscus, so the Grub Street writer called him, never stirred beyond the confines of his park or looked upon a stranger's face. He died of some slight complaint, which any country chirurgeon might have remedied. After his demise, it was discovered that he had tripled his securities and, dying intestate, left enough to make his heir one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. At the time of his uncle's death, Peregrine was page-in-waiting to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and at Leicester House had frequently met Lady Mary Tufton. His position, however, was not such as found favour in the eyes of my Lord Thanet, since his patrimony consisted of naught save a few hundred acres of Lincolnshire marsh and a green, lichened, moated house overrun with rats. But the great windfall caused the father to veer round suddenly. In sober truth, the Earl often played weathercock, and welcome young Master Fury with a stately blessing. Lady Mary had inherited considerable beauty from her mother, the Marquis of Halifax's daughter. She was tall and slender. Indeed, her height came to within an inch of Peregrine's, with a dainty silken skin and languishing, melting blue eyes. She had loved him for a full 12-month, and had been much troubled by her father's strenuous endeavours to wed her to one of her own rank. She had little of the virgin's foolish meekness. More than once she had threatened to enter a convent unless she could have the man of her own choice. When the death of Sir Agabus set all matters right, I dare swear that no happier girl could be found anywhere. Peregrine was, in man's fashion, as pleasant to look upon as she, a strongly built lad, with the frankest, handsomest face, quite unspoiled by the time he had spent in the artificial atmosphere of the court. He bade fair to become a greatly respected country gentleman, who would sit in Parliament, and maybe towards his latter end be rewarded with a barony. At Newhaven Inn, a great posting-house on the Manchester Road, within 2 stages of home, Mrs. Tryphena herself, who had been to the county town to arrange about the repairing of some hangings, joined them, and shared their carriage for the remainder of the journey. They did not resent her presence, as they would have done that of a less kindly woman, for she was mistress of consummate tact, and had ever been noted for her pleasing blindness to the foibles of young lovers. During the greater part of their drive together she sat very primly gazing from the nearest window, and not until they came in sight of the River Darrand for the first time did she make any remark beyond comments upon her delight in seeing them again. Then, in a pause of the young couple's little language, she leaned forward and took the wife's hand. "'Tis the strangest house I ever dreamed of," she said. "Sir Agabus, whatever may have been his faults, and I hold miserliness one of the worst that any man is capable of, possessed a virtue which atones for much, according to an old woman's way of thinking. When I reached Ravensdale I found not as much as a footstool unswathed in brown holland. 'Tis true that dust lay thick upon everything, but the fabrics wherewith the furniture's covered are fresh as when he bought anew for his wife's homecoming. The dame who played housekeeper, lackey, God knows what to the late master, assures me that the dust sheets had not been removed for a score years. and that her chief duty in autumn was the making of little bags of lavender. There's thousands of 'em all piled now in an empty chamber, to keep away the moths. The garden's in as perfect order as the house, on all the temples and belvederes. I vow there's as many here as at Stowe Park. The roofs are as perfect as if built but yesterday. Lady Mary turned happy eyes upon her husband. "And yet you never told me," she began. "I remember naught of Ravensdale," he replied, "since I was not more than a year old on my former visit. All will be as new to me as to you. We shall spend many hours in peering into every hole and corner." "A new Adam and Eve in a formal Eden," cried the spinster, who was something of a wit, "with not even a blind worm to play tempter. But, to speak plainly, the domain is vastly pleasant. All that I hold against it is its entire seclusion amongst the limestone hills. You'll be as far removed from the world as if you'd crossed the seas to Virginia. And now we're about to climb Black Harry, in my belief the highest hill of all these parts. Another 4 miles and we're at the lodge." They crossed the Darrand low with summer drought, at an ancient ford, and began to ascend the steep, deep-rutted road, which soon became little more than a track across the open heath. A magnificent prospect opened. North, east, and west rolled the billowing expanses of primeval moorland, the south being occupied by the bright Darrand valley and the serrated edge of Stanage. The red sun was setting behind a conical mound. A soft breeze swayed the white cotton grass in the hollows. To the right of the hilltop, a narrow clough descended to Ravensdale, whose concave was now filled with a mist faintly rose-coloured, pierced with the tops of heavy foliaged trees and the grotesquely twisted chimneys of the lodge. Peregrine and his wife, his arm round her waist, leaned from the open window and looked downwards. They had passed out of the warm sunlight now. Lady Mary shivered. He drew her close to his side. "'Tis like an enchanted world," she said. "Aunt Tryphena was right in calling it an Eden. There's no sign of life here." "We're to bring life," whispered the lover. "We're to people this world, and there'll be no angels with flaming swords." The coach passed suddenly through the rising curtain of mist, and at last the strange beauty of the valley became visible. The house, built in the latter part of Elizabeth's reign, was stately and large, its frontispiece containing more of window than of wall. Around lay gardens and a park where the sward was green as moss in winter, and where a shallow stream meandered level with its banks until it threaded a ravine that clove the rocky bank of the Darrand. A lake near by the terrace was full of yellow and white lilies, and in the centre a tall Neptune spurted thin jets from the end of his trident. The young husband and wife talked in low voices now. Somehow it seemed as if the time for idle prattle were past, until the coach drew up affront the colonnade, where an old woman gowned in sober black with white apron and cap stood curtsying. "This is Law, the housekeeper," said Mrs. Tryphena. "She holds it her duty to lift her mistress across the threshold, according to the custom of the family. The good soul, as faithful a creature as ever lived, for she starved in Sir Agabus's day rather than leave him in utter solitude, hath rehearsed the scene more than once." The dame, smiling as genially as a face whose nose and chin almost met would permit, took Lady Mary in her arms and tottered with her from the coach to the hall. "'Twas so I bore Sir Agabus's lady," she said breathlessly, "a beauty too, though not to be spoken of with you. I bid you welcome, sir and madam, and may God grant this be a happier house." Mrs. Tryphena now led the way, past the smirking newly hired servants, to the dining parlour, where, lighted with wax candles and silver sticks, the table was laid for supper. There, only doffing their travelling cloaks, they sat and spent the next hour in refreshment and talk. Afterwards Peregrine drew his wife to the window, and they stood with linked arms looking out upon the formal garden, white beneath the crescent moon. "Eden in night-time," said Lady Mary. "In truth, I believe there's no finer home in all the world than ours. What think you of a walk amongst yonder flowers?" A good housewife would not be content till she'd passed through every chamber of the place, but I'm no good housewife, and I'm cramped with our long journey. 'Twould refresh us both." He tied the strings of her cloak, and, with her arm still in his, conducted her from the house and down a great stone staircase to the French garden, where they walked to and fro for more than an hour, till both yawned sleepily and were minded to go bedward. As they reached the terrace, Peregrine saw a young gentleman, dressed in garments of antiquated cut, standing beside the mounting block, holding in his right hand a rose that glowed like a living ruby. He was watching them intently, his eyes lighted with a yellow gleam. The young husband, curious because of a stranger's presence, moved towards him, but he glided in perfect silence to the shadow of a gigantic cedar. Lady Mary gave a little cry. "Tell me why you started," she said. "You have seen someone." "Aye," he replied, "the oddest creature. See, there he walks down yonder yew path, quivering like to a leaf. Some friend, perchance of Sir Agabus, come to pay compliments, and taken with shyness." "Let's follow," she cried. "No visitor must go unwelcomed on our first night." Then, hand in hand, they ran along the path, catching ever and anon glimpses of the stranger, who, despite Peregrine's halloos, went on and on without turning. 1 second, I have to allow a cat entrance to the room. He is no doubt going to jump up on my lap. "As deaf as an adder," exclaimed Peregrine. "By the Lord, the fellow is as eccentric as old Sir Agabus himself." They stopped short, each with a gasp of surprise, for the yew alley terminated abruptly there, at the entrance of a cave whose roof and sides were covered with great shells. The man was no longer visible. Nothing stirred in that mysterious archway save a tiny stream that wound, clear as crystal, over the floor of variegated pebbles. "He's gone!" cried Peregrine. "How, I cannot tell, unless there's some opening in the hedge." Lady Mary's face had grown of a sudden very strained and haggard. "Let us go back," she said. "I am afraid. I saw him pass into the grotto." "Oh, come, Peregrine." Her voice broke foolishly. "I do not like this place in the moonlight. I am weary, cold." He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the house and up to her bedchamber. Whilst the Abigail undressed her, he wandered aimlessly through the suites, until by some odd chance he came across the housekeeper's parlour, where good Mrs. Law sat sipping her nightcap of slow cordial. She rose as he entered, but being of a genial nature he bade her resume her pleasant occupation, and chose for himself a chair at the further end of the hearth. "We came upon a stranger in the garden," he said, "a young man attired in the quaintest clothes, who disappeared in a way I cannot account for, near by a grotto with a stream." "Dear God!" muttered the woman, lifting her hand to her heart. "Dear God! There's no way by which anyone could have entered after your honour's coming, for at edge of dark all the gates were locked. It must have been the trees. The clipped yews cast marvellous shadows." "Not shadows with eyes that burn like coals," said Peregrine. "Nay, 'twas a living man who carried a rose in his hand. Moreover, he was not a little handsome, both of face and figure." Mrs. Law crossed herself. "Sir Agabus's lady once spoke of such an one," she said, "but none of the housefolk e'er came upon him, and 'tis more than 20 years since she died." "So it could not be Sir Agabus's lady friend," said her master laughingly. "Lady's friend," said her master laughingly. "Tomorrow maybe the gentleman will come again in full daylight, and we shall jest over our first meeting. Prithee, what cave is that we came to? There's shells there, and the inmost wall's made of stones roughly piled." The woman's forehead puckered like the shell of a walnut. "'Tis the grotto made by Sir Agabus for a whim of his lady's," she replied, "and 'twas there that she died. Lord, sir, I entreat you not to speak of it to my mistress. Sure, 'twould set her against the place. My late master built the screen himself afterwards, carrying each stone from the holy circle on the hilltop." She promised loquacity, but Peregrine, mindful of his wife, bade her good night and returned to the chamber, where he slept soundly until the valley was warm with morning sunlight. The greater part of that day the young folk spent in Mrs. Tryphaena's company, rambling through the house and wondering at the many curious portraits of long since dead men and women. Sir Agabus's wife proved most to Lady Mary's liking, for the painter had depicted to perfection her exquisite pride of countenance and bearing. There was a marked resemblance between the two women. Both had the dainty colour and long tapering fingers of patrician inheritance, but the living wife was lacking in a peculiar aloofness of the eyes, which in the other suggested that the mind dwelt overmuch on something vague and distant. A picture of earlier date hung beside, that of a comely youth with a Roman nose and a pouting red mouth, whose right hand held a rose, whilst the other toyed carelessly with the diamond buttons of a white waistcoat embellished with fantastical needlework. "How strange 'tis," observed Lady Mary pensively. "Here are two full of life, and yet gone forever, with scarce a trace left of aught they did." Just then one came with word that the bailiff desired an interview. Sir Peregrine left his wife and went to the gun-room, where he was soon deep in discussion concerning a suitable breed of cattle wherewith to stock the park. Lady Mary and Mrs. Tryphaena left the house and loitered through the garden, pausing at last before the grotto at the end of the yew alley, where the girl told the odd experience of the preceding evening. Mrs. Tryphaena declared herself a believer in ghosts. "Surely 'twas some restless spirit, a bachelor perhaps, whom love of you hath driven to the shades." Lady Mary shook her head. "The only suitor I ever had opportunity of denying was corpulent and elderly," she said. "My Lord Wollaston still lives in the flesh. He gave me the wedding gift of Indian diamonds. This is the place where the gentleman disappeared. See, the shells over yonder are wrought in the motto, 'Love once, love ever.'" After a while she began to examine the barrier of stone that formed the inner wall, and touching one of the topmost caused it to fall, leaving a hole as big as a child's head. Thereupon Mrs. Tryphaena, being of a curious nature, peeped through, then fell back with affected dismay. "La!" she cried, "I could have sworn that a man stood there, one with a face as white as death itself." Lady Mary, all eagerness, pressed her own face to the opening, but saw nothing but a dim avenue of grey stalactites, lighted by reflections of sunlight from the stream that came through the chinks in the loose masonry. "'Tis like to a cathedral aisle," she said. "I'll bid Peregrine order the removal of these boulders, and this shall be my own retiring place. What if the passage goes into the very entrails of the earth?" But Mrs. Tryphaena laid a hand upon her sleeve. "I could have sworn that someone laughed as you were speaking," she whispered. "Come back into the garden, my pretty." Lady Mary drew aside almost petulantly. "Dear aunt," she said, "I dote upon the place. There's the posy, which shall always remind me of Peregrine, and the air's cool and fresh and sweet." At that moment her husband appeared, and telling him of the vista that lay beyond the stones, she won from him a promise to have the cave reopened ere another day had gone by, and to explore it in her company, with clues and torches if need be. So, on the morrow, the barrier being removed, they went there together, and for more than 2 hours were lost in the upper world, thridding the countless galleries of a marvellous lusus naturae, where the floors were of fine dry sand, and the walls of limestone smooth as ivory. The place was so full of windings that at last both wearily declared that a month might be passed ere its wonders were exhausted. In the following week the weather grew extraordinarily hot and sultry, and since Peregrine was much occupied with necessary business, Lady Mary found herself at liberty to spend many hours in her grotto, which in truth was the only cool place in the valley. Her embroidery frame was carried there, and at first she worked laboriously upon a cravat for her spouse's wearing. Mrs. Tryphaena, whom both had entreated to stay permanently at Ravensdale, was assiduously occupied in examining and repairing the contents of the great linen presses, or supervising the conservation of fruits, whilst Law, in consideration of her faithful services in Sir Agabus's day, still retained nominally the post of housekeeper. One morning, in the still room, the old woman found herself constrained to speak of her former mistress's strange ending. "I like not her ladyship's going so off to yon cave," she remarked, "since 'twas there Sir Agabus's lady used to go, whilst she peaked and pined away almost to an anatomy." Until now she had been reticent concerning the lady's tragedy, but today, as if stirred with dread lest a like misfortune should overtake the young wife, she waxed very confidential, and told Mrs. Tryphena the oddest story. It had the effect of sending the spinster hot foot to the grotto, where she found her niece fast asleep by the embroidery frame, her upturned face smiling mysteriously, as if she dreamed of matters pleasant beyond human ken. She touched her somewhat roughly on the shoulder. "You are unwise to sleep here," she said. "The air is cold enough to strike a chill to your bones. Come out into the sun, my dear. Why, you've lost all your colour." Lady Mary rose, passing her hand drowsily over her eyes. "You cannot let me be," she said with a new querulousness. "Is there something wrong in my dreams that you must spy upon me day after day?" Mrs. Tryphena stared in wonderment. "'Tis I, Mary," she said. "I, your aunt. You know that I have never spied." The girl began to laugh confusedly. My head's all bewildered," she said. I thought 'twas Peregrine himself, and I was far away from here, in a world of my own, a wonderful world, all full of romance." After they had returned to the lodge, Mrs. Tryphena contrived a private conversation with the husband. "I beg of you," she said, "to forbid your wife to frequent the grotto. The place is ill-omened. 'Twas there that the lady of Sir Agabus lost her strength, her life. Indeed, there's something, I know not what, of the unfortunate—" He dismissed her objections lightly. How could I cross one whom I love so well?" he said. "Forbiddances shall never come from me, whose sole desire is to make her happy. Nay, good aunt, listen to no more old wives' tales." "Ay," interrupted Mrs. Tryphena, "but sure you have not forgotten how on the night you came here you saw an unknown gentleman?" "'Twas some hapless fellow with a greeting he was too shy to make, or perhaps some Scotch rebel making his way across country to the border. Our sympathies are with such." So Mrs. Tryphena went away, very discontented, resolved to neglect the household duties that she had taken upon herself, and to accompany her niece whenever she went to the grotto. This, however, met with Lady Mary's disapproval, and ere long the officious spinster found the place entirely deserted save for herself, and with a satisfied mind returned to the 1,000 avocations of the great house. But Lady Mary went there privately, and day by day her beautiful colour faded, and she grew more and more listless. The wise elderly folk wrongly attributed this to a natural cause. More than once speech was made to Mrs. Tryphena of the day when Ravensdale Park would echo with feux de joie, and the distant bells of Hassage Church would chime in blithe announcement to the countryside of the birth of Peregrine's heir. It was not until autumn was far advanced that the great tragedy occurred. One night, when the air was very still, and the skies covered with black cloud, Peregrine woke to find himself alone, and after hastily donning his clothes, made a fruitless search through the wing devoted to their use, then hurried to Mrs. Tryphena's bedchamber. "Mary is gone," he stammered. "I can find her nowhere." The aunt rose from her canopied bed, and huddled on a wrapper. "She cannot have left the house," she said, incredulously. "She must be restless. I will come with you. Prithee, do not rouse the servants." They passed through many other chambers, calling faintly, but found no clue until they came to the hall, where, to the amazement of both, the door hung ajar. "If she be not indoors," faltered Mrs. Tryphena, "there's but one place she would go on such a night." A lantern stood here upon the table. She lighted its candle and led the way through the garden to the grotto, and in the yew alley their hearts grew very cold and heavy, for they heard the sound of voices speaking softly. Peregrine stumbled against Mrs. Tryphena. "She is here, and not alone," he muttered. My God, what does it mean?" The spinster trembled so that she could scarce stand. "'Tis no living man who's with her," she said bravely. "I'll not believe such wickedness." But still the voices murmured, one sweet and low and bewitching, the other a faint and incoherent echo of the wife's. The words of both were indistinguishable, but the tones were laden with burning passion. Peregrine caught the lantern from Mrs. Tryphina's hand and staggered forward into the blackness, and then fell back at sight of Lady Mary sitting on the ground beside the stream, her head bowed to her bosom. A sharp, bitter cry came from the inner recesses of the place. 'Twas a woman's voice raised in agony. Then a dimness came into Peregrine's eyes, so that he saw his wife no longer. He leaped forward. Two figures hurried ever before him, one cruelly familiar, t'other that of a tall, dark man who laughed and laughed and laughed. They sped along passages where hitherto no human foot had ever trod. They climbed the steep sides of monstrous caverns. They slipped through narrow apertures, bending almost double where the roof hung low, until at last they reached a vast vault filled with the noise of falling water. There they stopped short where the sandy floor broke, on the verge of a pit into which a cataract fell from the lip of a jagged rock overhead. Peregrine put out his hand to grasp a loose sleeve of the woman's gown. Ere his fingers closed, she turned, discovering a countenance fretted with an unendurable grief. The man stood with face averted, an arm firmly encircling her waist. "Ah, do not leave me!" cried the husband. "Come back! Come back!" The ashen lips moved in silence. One hand strove feebly to remove the imprisoning arm, but her companion drew her closer still, and sprang into the utter blackness of the pit, and Peregrine was left alone. Hours passed ere Peregrine left the place, hours in which he heard naught save the roaring of the water. The candle guttered, the last spark died as he reached the grotto at the cave's mouth. The sun had risen. All the east was rich with purple and amber clouds. A heavy mist hung over the park. Cattle were lowing for milking time. Mrs. Tryphina sat on the pebbles beside her niece, whose cheek rested against her shoulder. The old lady did not observe him until his foot touched her skirt. "Thank God!" he cried hoarsely. "'Twas but a nightmare, the cruellest nightmare man ever knew. I believed that she had gone forever." He knelt at their side. Mrs. Tryphina held him back with a trembling hand. "Oh, I am worn with waiting," she moaned. "How could you leave me?" "I have been tricked. Some devilry forced me to see. Ah, speak to me, wife." "Hush," faltered Mrs. Tryphina. "She has never stirred. She will never stir." And that's the end of the grotto at Ravensdale. And I think that leaves us just time for one more, which will be bubble magic, and I'll get onto that in a second. But firstly, Lahumph, hey, welcome. I hope you've had a good evening. We're banging through some stories tonight. I've done a few. Done the Basilisk, the Witching Grain, story about a witch getting thrown in some mud. Don't do that; it ends up badly. Yeah, that was the grotto at Ravensdale. We've had excerpts from Witherton's journal about an artist who's just kind of an ass. And there's going to be like more meaning in there, but I'll be damned if I can get it. And yeah, the last one for tonight. Actually, quickly before I do that, I'm going to have some water, which I don't keep at the desk anymore for reasons that we know. Oh, salad, you've got to be off. You are welcome. Thank you for being here, and I hope you have enjoyed it. Excuse me, I've also got hiccups or something coming up. So yeah, no, it's good to see you. And yes, indeed, go rest and sleep and things like that, or whatever it is you're going to. Yes, I'm going to be right back. 2 seconds. Ah, delicious lukewarm room temperature water. Just what you need. But yeah, just going to make myself comfy for the last story this evening. which is another story. One sec. Actually, just going to mute the mic while I reposition it. And all good. Humph, you're here now? Ah, okay. I assumed that was what the heart meant, but I'm assuming that you were like busy and away and stuff. But yeah, this is just get my light on the book. This is the last story for tonight. I'm trusting the volume's still okay. I'm sitting a little bit further away from the mic. I might actually bump the gain up a little bit more because it looks fairly quiet. I don't know. Sounds good to you? Okay. I mean, I've got. Let's whack 10 decibels on that. It was on 9. I've not just suddenly gone up 10 dubs. Bit more wouldn't be bad. Sure. Yeah. Hopefully that's a bit better. All good? Good. I was saying at the start, what I should have done this week, and completely forgot that I needed to do, is actually find a guide to setting up your audio on OBS, like I've done in the past, and actually get it nice and clean and tuned up and all proper and good, and other such things. Didn't do it. We'll need to try and do it before next week, because, it'd be nice to have. Now that this whole setup is on its new home at last, and yeah. But before it gets much later, let's get on with the last story, which is Bubble Magic. The last hind had left the booth. The ambassador, the page, and Clorinda were spreading supper on the trestled table behind the tattered stage curtain. Yesternight had been a benefit, and we were now to eat the remnants of the feast. We had played Philip Massinger's Maid of Honour, and though our acting was stirring enough, few of the country folk had ventured. We sat at table in our players' clothes. I, the master, was Bertoldo, Mary Percival, Camiola, Mrs. Brookwith, the Duchess of Siena. Robert, Ferdinand, and the rest were made up of recruits from town. Stupid prattle came from the further end, but where we three sat there was naught but whispering. Camiola's nut-brown hair lay down her back. My fingers stole amongst it, and made a nest. There was no expression in her colourless, almost haggard face, save that of passion. She would not taste the viands, but once, when I had drunk and turned to speak with the Duchess, her hand stole to my beaker, and her lips pressed where mine had pressed. Mrs. Brookwith's gorgeous colouring put me in mind of an old-fashioned garden. She was not without beauty, but 'twas the beauty of peonies and Turk's caps. Moreover, her eyes were bright and sparkling as the toads that lurks beneath such flowers. They hinted of vast knowledge acquired by a placid contemplation of the strange. Our talk turned on love. Camiola said with a shudder that though she had never suffered, such a thing must be horrible, must burn out the heart, must leave a woman naught but an empty shell. The Duchess laughed dryly, and passing one plump, be-ringed hand behind my shoulder, stroked the girl's neck. "Dear child," she said, "when you are old as I, and have passed so oft through the flame, you will know that 'tis not love, but falsity that burns and destroys." I interrupted her with, "I hold love to be nowise great as friendship. A friend who preserves a perfect faith is the best gift Providence bestows." For I was thinking of Norris, who even that day had written, for the 100th time, proffering to help if my affairs were disordered. As children we were bedfellows, and though he had heired a great estate, he had ever held me as his bosom friend. Twice already he had rescued me from poverty, calling me Quixote, and taking away all shame. I loved him more than a brother. "Ah, you have never loved. By some rare chance you have escaped the fire," retorted the Duchess, drawing her hand from Camiola's neck and laying it on my breast. "This heart awaits its torture," she added. Camiola, sighing querulously, threw in, "Men cannot understand women." Just then one drew aside the curtain that oped to the field, and showed us the bright hues of the setting sun. The chain of talk grew brighter and brighter as the ale and wine went round. Unobserved, we stole from the table and went through the court of the Green Man. No sooner had we reached the herb garden that lies east of the archway, when the Duchess turned to me somewhat abruptly. "You have perchance not forgotten that Earl Russetwell carried me to Italy and detained me there 5 years?" she said. "In that time I gathered forbidden fruits. I know much of love. Would you that I showed to yourself, Bertoldo, and to our sweet maid of honour here, some little trick of the near future?" Camiola in haste assented for both, and Mrs. Brookworth hurried up the stone stairs to the gallery, where lay the women's chambers, to return with a white silken case, which presently disclosed a tiny pipe of gold and a crystal phial half filled with rosy liquid. "Let us remove to a more secret place," she said. She led the way down the ill-kept alley of box to a lawn, where the yew fowls had lost all shape. In an arbour adorned with portraits of long-moulded gamesters, we sat, the waning afterglow hanging overhead. "'Tis naught but the blowing of bubbles in magic water," she explained. "You, Camiola, shall have the first sight. Observe me, and when the bubble attains its largest, peep into the picture." Wherewith she poured into the hollowed palm of her left hand a shallow pool, and, bedabbling the bowl, blew and blew until the bubble swelled to the size and form of a citron. She motioned with her head for Camiola to look, and the girl bent forward. A cry of rapture leapt from her lips. A rich colour filled her cheeks. The bubble burst, but her inspired loveliness remained. She clasped her hands. She gazed upon me. I read new-born joy in her eyes. She would have spoken, but her heart beat far too quickly. She took up a flower I had culled in the garden, unfastened her laces, and let it fall to her bosom. "What did she see?" I asked in jealous eagerness. "Nay, that is not in my law. I saw only floating colours. 'Tis your turn now." Again she stirred the water with the bowl, and this time blew a bubble as big as a child's head. At her nod I stooped and peered into the thing, and saw the garden, amethyst, scarlet, sapphire, yellow, crystal green, blood colour, and, as it were, the yew-birds fought. But within the moment the garden disappeared, and in its place came a moor where curlews flew and a mountain river threshed into spume, and afterwards a squat thatched house with many dormers. The door of this opened, and Penthea herself, the one woman for whom my feelings resembled passion, stood on the threshold and held out her arms towards me. "Sure, 'tis Penthea!" I cried unconsciously. The bubble burst. Mrs. Brookworth smiled. "Whatever you have seen, and I have small desire to know," she said, "depend upon it 'tis true. If Madame Penthea were in the picture—" "She stood as waiting to clip me," I faltered. "Prithee show me another bubble that I may know more." "Not so, my friend. There'd be no virtue in it. And I must return. You have forgotten that I am to design a new gown for mine honourable daughter, Margaret Overreach. Fare thee well." She poured back the drops that lay in her palm, and dried the golden pipe, then rose, and with the curtsy that she used so admirably in the plays, moved from the arbour. I followed with many entreaties, but she was implacable, and at last I went to my chamber and began to write a long letter to my mistress, telling her of the sweetest vision. Ere long, however, my eyes lifted and fell on a yellowed map that hung between mantel and window, and looking carefully upon it, to my amaze I found that Bleaklow was but 15 miles distant. So I tore up the sheet, and having studied the way, without a word to any of my folk, set out to visit her, though 'twas but a fortnight since we had parted, and our next meeting was to have been soon. Mine hostess lent me a tinder-box and a horn lantern, declaring that I should need them in the woodland, and then, having ascertained the road to the next village, I set off in haste. Darkness had already fallen. One by one the stars blinked into being. My repeater told me 'twas 10 by the clock. The white line of the road kept me from straying, till I reached Hunter's Manor, where the hamlet lies at the entrance of Garden Wood. Most of the villagers were abed, but a decrepit gaffer, already half-stripped, had bethought himself that his toll-gate was not yet locked for the night. Of him I inquired the way to Bleaklow, but 'twas long ere his dimmed brain could take in my question, and at the first wave of his hands toward a bridle path that struck directly to the heart of the forest, I hurried onward, and, in the hollowed bole of the first great tree, struck a light and fired my lantern. Garden Wood was in its rarest beauty. Autumn had tinged the leaves all imaginable shades of red and brown and green. The cold air, methought it froze, was pregnant with the rich smell of withering leaves. Here and there as I went, where a mice that haply had never beheld a lantern before, beat down and rattled the horn. Owls wailed out their melancholy. Up in the branches were squirrels with glistening teeth, and in the damp vistas will-with-the-wisp was jerking. The place was full of life. Ripples of mirth came from the streams that prattled across the path. In one grove of half-withered cedars that was threatened by a falling gable, moans and sighs crept from the tips of the boughs. Of a sudden, one in pure white tripped from behind an undergrowth of young poplars, and a sweet breath touched my cheek. 'Twas Camiola, dressed as I had seen her last, and still adorned with courtly gewgaws. "I have waited for long," she said, with a shiver, "but now that you are come, it seems scarce a moment since we parted. I go with you, as your page, as your lantern-bearer." I dissented. "The walk is far too long, child," I said. "Go back, take the lantern. You have no coverings for your head. I insist." Feigning contrition, she stopped, but caught the iron ring of the lantern, and no sooner had she possession when she flew for some paces in front, nor would she permit me to lessen the space between us, until I had vowed to use no more persuasion, but to permit her to have her will. In truth, she made a very dainty picture. We linked arms, she still swaying the lantern by her skirt, and so in silence passed through the forest of Garden Wood, and reached an edge traversed by many a pack-horse track. There, as I pondered on the right way, Camiola spoke. "'Tis this," she said, pointing to the least worn. "Already I hear the water." Listening, I too heard the sound of a hissing river thrown into flood by storms in the upland. Yet I was bewildered by Camiola's knowledge. "How comes it, mistress, that you know the way?" I asked. "The bubble magic showed me, and I have the keener ears," she made answer. "Now, since I have replied frankly, tell me who is this madam we go to see?" Her tone was somewhat contemptuous. I was affronted. "The woman I love. She who is to be my wife." Camiola's limber fingers twined about mine. Poor soul, poor soul. She sighed, whether for pity of Penthea or of me I knew not. A flock of curlews flapped overhead, whistling and hissing, and Camiola shrank closer to my side. I had not divined that her nearness would enchant me so subtly. We reached a narrow clough that sloped to the river. There, as we crossed the flints, I heard her quench a moan, and, seeing that she walked lamely, asked if she were in pain. "My feet," she said, above the noise of the river, "my feet were not shod for such a journey." In the lantern light she raised her left foot and showed me the once white satin stained with the green juices of the grass, and the sole flapping apart from the rest. "You go no further," I said. "See, I will leave my coat to cover you, and the lantern also shall be yours. I will send from the house. Surely it cannot be very far." Camiola laughed merrily, as if she prisoned some secret. "You will never send from her house to me," she replied. "I can walk. 'Twas but a pebble got underneath my heel. I will bind it with my bodice lace thus." She drew out one of the silken cords and strapped it crosswise about her instep. "I am ready," she said. At the stepping stones I caught her to my heart, and with one arm of hers encircling my neck, and the other outstretched in front with the lantern, we crossed the perilous place. On the further bank I struck my repeater again, and found that midnight was past by 2 hours. There was no path visible now, so perforce we made our way through the stunted beech spinney. On the summit of a limestone hill, where grey, ghostly things peeped from the thin sward, I saw the gables of Bleaklow, with a light burning in Penthea's window. Camiola grasped my arm convulsively, and then held the lantern so that I might see her face. "Tell me," she whispered fondly, "is mistress as beautiful as I?" My tongue was on the point of declaring rashly that Penthea was peerless, when it was borne upon me, with some uneasiness, that the loveliness of her with whom I travelled could not be excelled. For there was a wonderment of gay beauty in her face. It seemed as a virgin soul played there. Erstwhile I had deemed her coldly charming. Now I wondered how she had come to preserve through so many trials that exquisite passion. "Not more beautiful," I hesitated. She lowered the lantern, and again we progressed until we came to the bed of rushes beside the long pool. There the herons were beginning to stir. Camiola gazed, as in some fashion afraid, along the old road that runs from Silence Village to Bleaklow. Near us lay a rock basin, where the water gushed down on pebbles and yellow sand. "My feet are hot and tired. Let me bathe them here," she said, "but for a minute. I would fain see the lady, a constant woman's heart." Sitting on the ground, she undid her shoes and drew off her stockings. She dabbled her feet in the rillock, crying out in delight, and though I craved so keenly for sight of Penthea, in truth I felt no impatience now. "Why not rest beside me, Bertoldo?" she said. "Sure, there's no harm in staying a while. I am very weary." I sank to a tussock, setting the lantern betwixt us. She curved her neck so that the breeze might bring with it the lightest sound. Ever and anon she looked toward the road. Once she paled and smote her breast, but the moment afterward her colour returned, and she took off her kerchief and dried her feet and donned her stockings and shoes. "I hold love to be no wise great as friendship," she said, repeating in a mocking voice my words of yestereven. A friend who preserves a perfect faith is the best gift Providence bestows." My hand moved to take the lantern. On my fingers fell a hasty shower of tears. Camiola wept, wherefore I could not understand. "Dear child!" She recovered herself soon. "Oh, that I had never come!" she murmured. Before us, in the gloom, whinnied a mare that galloped eastward, as to welcome the dayspring. Then the curtain lifted, and the sky flushed with all the hues I had seen in the bubble, and soon the sun, gigantic and ruddy, lifted himself from the fork of a hill. Morning came in strides. From the thorn bushes rose birds, piping autumnally. We stole along the depressions of the ground, for I was anxious that Penthea might not behold me till I had reached the garden. The light in her window was extinguished, or was it that the blaze of the sun dazzled my eyes? At the gate of the wood-close I turned to Camiola. "Sweetheart," I said, "my mistress, 'twould be best for me to see her first and explain your company. Stay here a while. I will return very soon." All rosy was she in the first light, so rare, indeed, that I was loath to part. "Ay, leave me, dearest," she cried with tender cajolery. "Leave me if thou canst." Even as she spoke, Penthea threw open her door and gazed eastward along the grass-brown road, and held out her arms, as to draw one bosomward. I moved forward. Camiola caught my cloak with one hand, and with the other pointed to where Norris approached, spurring his great white stallion. And that's the end of Bubble Magic. And the last story for tonight. So thank you for listening.